Okay, hello. Welcome everyone. And thanks for coming to this coveted 6:30 slot just before you have a drink. So if you get thirsty, we won't feel bad if you leave, but we will take your name down and remember this forever. And you don't want to cross us. So my name is Gina Chua for another 7 glorious days. I'm executive editor at Reuters, and then after that I will be executive editor at Semafor, and none of that matters, so let's not talk about it. This panel is really talking about coverage. So there's a lot of talk about how we should have more diverse newsrooms, we should be more inclusive, and all of that makes sense. We should absolutely do that. But that inclusion and diversity in newsrooms is, while it's important for its own right, is also there to serve a purpose. And the purpose it's supposed to serve is to make our coverage better. So I want to just cite an example from Reuters, which I don't pick out particularly just because I'm leaving, but it's a good example, and we fixed it very quickly, which is we wrote a story that said, China has sent a rocket to space that, with 5 astronauts, including 2 women, to, go to the space station. What's wrong with that story? Well, when did astronauts become men? Why didn't we say China sent a rocket with 5 astronauts, including 3 men, right? And so saw that, sent a note, we fixed it really quickly. That's great, right? But the point of that is not that we're a bad news organization. We're, in fact, a very good news organization. But that coverage, fixing coverage, understanding coverage is the job for everybody. It doesn't take a woman to call that out. It doesn't take a Chinese woman to call that out. It's everyone's job. If we were to depend on representation in the newsroom to fix things, that would be grossly unfair to the 1 black person, the 3 women, the 1 straight guy. Whatever it is, you can't go to them and say, hey, what does your community think about this? Because that's not fair to them, it's not fair to the organization, it's not fair to the community. So what we want to talk here about today is how we can make coverage better with or without representation. How do we make news organizations more sensitive to such issues and just improve the coverage and serve our audiences and communities better? So what's really good about this panel is that I'm not the one with the expertise, that we have Marina Walker, who's with the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting. Is that the full name, or we just call it Pulitzer Center these days? We call it Pulitzer Center. Oh, fine, okay. Marina Walker, Pulitzer Center, Wendi Thomas, founder and editor of MLK 50, and on the line, we hope, if she ever comes back, is that a yes? No? Maybe?
Not
okay.
Yet.
Well,
yet.
If we can, we will have Lydia Namubiru, and it's really good that she's not around to hear me mangle her name, with openDemocracy on the line. And whenever she comes in, we'll bring her up to speed. So we want to just sort of have this as a nice open conversation among the 3 of us and all of you. Officially, you're not supposed to ask questions, but we don't care. It's 6:30. So when we get to that point, like raise your hand, yell, try not to give any germs to anybody else. So why don't we start with you, Marina, and talk a little bit about, what animates you about this topic?
Great. Well, hello, everyone. So nice to be here with you in person. What brings me to this talk, I guess, is a little bit of my career path. For 15 years, my job was to convince lone wolf investigative reporters to instead collaborate, to put collaboration at the center of their practice, not necessarily because we love to do that. It's complicated. It's nerve-wracking, but because for the sake of the story, because we, investigative reporters, were missing the best stories of our time by competing, by working in silos, and by hoarding information in an individualistic way. So the ICIJ came around. I was fortunate to work there for many years, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. But the word that I want to lead with is humility and intentionality. Sometimes even the most noble of organizations and missions and ideas, if we are not humble and intentional about how we put them together, they can go in an unintended direction. At the beginning, ICIJ was a network that was mostly male and was very Western. So it was there to fulfill a mission, but at some point we stopped and said, this is not really representing the world that we intend to cover and the important stories that we intend to cover. So what do? Do you fire the entire network that you had up to that point, made of like wonderful reporters? No, you expand it, and you intentionally seek all those other voices that were so relevant. But the other thing we weren't doing is that we hadn't put guidelines in place to govern the power dynamics of a global network. And so when you don't have that clarity of intention and those guidelines, the strongest ones, the strongest voices, the Western voices tended to dominate the coverage, to dominate the frameworks and the relationships. And so once we started working intentionally in all of those aspects, that's when we had in place a network that was able to undertake a work like the Panama Papers. Thankfully for the world and for journalism, we had done that internal work by the time that whistleblowers entrusted us with that story. Now, fast forward to my current job. I joined the Pulitzer Center 2 years ago. The Pulitzer Center supports local journalists, like the ones that I always work with at the ICIJ, but also correspondents. And so what I did from the very beginning with my team is we started to think about that relationship between correspondents and local journalists, a relationship that traditionally has been fraught with inequality, and I would say in some cases even exploitation. And we started again looking inside and realizing that we were in some ways not helping always to make it better. And we started with language. We started small, change starts small. So we realized, how are we calling our local partners around the world? We're calling them fixers, right? It was on our website, it was on our application forms, it's in the program. There's a whole panel on Mexican journalists called The Role of Fixers. Well, you talk to your local counterparts in different countries, they don't like that word. They're like, one of them asked, like, am I fixing your bicycle, your car? What am I fixing of yours? So we went on a quest, on a task of erasing that word, replacing that word with the word local reporting partner. And we took it out of all of our website, our forms. We also added a question to our application forms for grants, and the question was, started with a statement: we value collaboration among journalists, newsrooms, and also between correspondents and local journalists. Are you planning to collaborate with anybody? And if so, how are you going to go about it? And then we sat back and said, okay, let's wait and see what happens. And it was really remarkable how in just a few months, that word, like, it's not that when we stopped saying that and when we challenged the reporters with the collaboration question, the conversation completely changed. First of all, nobody was using fixer anymore, but also the journalists were saying things like, yes, I'm collaborating with a Mozambican reporter in my story about an ISIS insurgency, and I wonder if you can advise how I can have a conversation with my editor about making sure that that journalist has the same insurance that I am going to have as an AP correspondent or whatever. There were questions about bylines. And there were even questions about, like, can you advise on what would be a fair rate? So a small change that created a whole different mentality. From there, we took it a step further, and I'll stop here. When we were planning coverage of a very important story that we're all facing as a planet, the destruction of our rainforest, which is intimately linked to climate change, of course. So that is a story that is local. It happens in the regions, in the Congo Basin, in the Amazon, in Southeast Asia. We saw it as a great opportunity. What do? Do you only support the local journalists because they live in the regions? Are they the only ones that should be telling that story? Well, that is a local story and it's a global story because those commodities are being, right? They end up here. They end up in Europe, in China, in the US. So what we did is we put together a topical network, learning from our lessons at ICIJ, focusing on the rainforest regions and bringing together the local journalists and the global journalists and the correspondents. So the local journalists can contribute their expertise, their access, their unique knowledge and nuance, and the global journalists can help trace the money all the way back to the markets and also give the visibility that sometimes the local reporting doesn't get, to make those companies and those governments really care and really be embarrassed. So within a few months, we started hearing from more global media outlets. And what they were saying is, they were not saying like, give us money or send us to these places. They were saying, can we be part of this network? Why do you want to be part of this network? Because we want to work with these reporters, with these local reporters.
Oh, thank you, Wendi. What animates you about this question?
I think what animates me about this question really comes from the work that I've been able to do at MLK 50, Justice Through Journalism in Memphis. For the last 5 years now, we marked our 5th anniversary on Monday. And so it's really an opportunity to kind of create the newsroom that I would have always wanted to work in after 25 years in daily newspapers in the States, mainly the Midwest and Southeast. And so when I think about the kind of the work that we want to do and how we got started, so as our name implies, we have a connection to Dr. Martin Luther King. And so we launched in April 2017 in the lead up to the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination. And so I grew up in Memphis, have spent a long time there, and could see the city leaders planning to go into celebration mode, right? Look at how far we've come since 1968 when Dr. King was killed. But I saw that as this milestone as an opportunity to force the community to consider what we'd done with Dr. King's sacrifice. And a lot of the issues that were prevalent when Dr. King came to Memphis, and the issues that brought him to Memphis, which was striking black sanitation workers, were still present in Memphis 50 years later. In fact, there were sanitation workers who were working for the city in 1968 who were still working for the city in 2018 because they couldn't afford to retire, right? And so those kind of systemic poverty issues were very prevalent, and so I assembled a team of, at first, freelance journalists, and now we have full-time journalists, to really ask these questions and challenge power in a moment when I knew that mainstream media was just going to go along with, hey, the celebration, we're dedicating a park, you know, we're having a parade, we're having a $75 a plate dinner, knowing that most people in Memphis, which is 2/3 black and has a very high poverty rate, couldn't afford to participate in those celebrations. And so doing work that's kind of deliberately disrupting the status quo, I think gives me joy. Being a black woman-led newsroom also animates me. There aren't a lot of us. We're a nonprofit newsroom. But yeah, I'm excited about the future that we're building.
So let me just follow up for a second on that, right? So, you know, we're not calling out people who have done bad work, and we're not criticizing anybody per se, although you're welcome to if you want to. So the newsrooms in Memphis at the time didn't do the stories, right? And you felt that there was a perspective that had been missing. So why do you think they didn't have that perspective? Why was it they didn't see those stories, and why didn't they do them?
Yeah, so, you know, I don't want to dump on any of my journalism colleagues. We're all working in newsrooms where we're being asked to do more with less, right? But I think that part of what makes MLK 50 different is that we have a proximity. We're very intentional about the proximity we have to the stories, to the people. We have wonderful relationships with activists, organizers, people who are really trying to change their communities for the better. And so without that proximity, you just don't see it. You're just not in the spaces to see it. You're not talking to the people who are experiencing it. And so I think getting as close as you can to the people who are most affected is critical.
So let me hold that thought, and I'll come back to you. You have the you know, well, not privilege, because you actually went out and did it, of creating a newsroom that would have those perspectives. You work with all sorts of newsrooms, some of whom are, you know, great newsrooms with real legacies to them. How do you help them look at stories or perspectives they might not have? Again, you know, when we're not criticizing any other paper in Memphis, but they clearly didn't see some things. How do you help people see things that they might not see?
Sometimes it's just like asking a question and being curious. At the Pulitzer Center, those who decide who is going to get the support are journalists. We're all editors, and we try to, and have assembled what could always be better, but it's trying to be quite a diverse team, and so. With that, we rather than get so excited about, oh my God, this is such a big newsroom, it's going to be enormous distribution, is asking the questions, have you thought about this other angle? Who is powerful in this? How's this power distributed in this story that you are trying to cover? Have you ever been in that country? If you have never been in that country, may we introduce you to a great local reporter? May you be willing to collaborate with that reporter? Perhaps that reporter can be a co-grantee or a co-author. We can help talk to your editor. We can help explain why that is important for us. And what audiences are going to be, we partner with the journalists to think a lot about the audiences. Ultimately, who is going to benefit? Are we preaching to the choir? Are we talking to the same people that we always talked about? So during the pandemic, just a quick example, the question was, we were supporting a lot of journalists around the world doing pandemic stories, but so what voices were missing? And how were those journalists, how could we help journalists? So when they came to us and they said, we want to cover the story of the homeless in several cities around the US. Well, how are you going to do that? You are stuck at home. The homeless are either on the streets or some of them are in shelters that they were required in some cases to go to shelters. How are you going to do this story? So they went back, so they hadn't figured it out. They were, well, we'll just see, we'll talk to the experts, we'll call the shelter. Oh, no, where's the perspective of the homeless person? So these journalists, they regrouped and they came back and they came up with an idea that was creative. With our support, they bought some burner phones, and they actually shipped those phones to shelters. They identified people who lived in those shelters, clients, and they kept in touch with them throughout weeks and in some cases months through those phones to be able to follow their stories and the evolution of life as a homeless during the pandemic, as a homeless person. So small things like that, just asking questions and pushing. You can do this as an editor, you can do this as a funder. We all are in a position where we can push one another to think differently and to challenge the way that we've always done things, and that often it has not been maybe the better way.
So I hear two things from you. One is just that first question about what is the story, and and then the other one is how do you do it, right? And I think in this case they were both both interesting innovations. How do you think through what are stories that should be done, and I guess more pertinently, what advice do you give for organizations that perhaps need to be thinking a little more deeply about what the stories are that they just don't see because they don't see?
Right. So for advice, I'll take the first part, and the second part first. For advice, I think of something that a professor that I had during my Neiman Fellowship at Harvard said. It was Professor Matt Desmond. He wrote this book on housing instability called Evicted. If you ever get a chance to read it, it reads like a novel. It does not read like an academic book. And he said, what if poverty isn't an accident, but it's a robbery? So what if poverty isn't an accident, but a robbery? And so I thought about that. And I think poverty is a robbery. And if it's a robbery, that means there's thieves. And the thieves' names could be known. So what if you covered poverty the way we cover crime, where you were actively looking for who the thieves were, who were the people that were exploiting labor, often exploiting labor, and named those people, right? That's a completely different lens on how to frame a story. The reason poverty persists is because people profit from it. And so who are the people that are profiting and exploiting labor, which is very consistent with our namesake's vision of economic justice. So yeah, now remind me of the first part of that
How do
question.
you help people find these ideas and stories?
Yeah, so I think, asking who stands to profit from something, who stands to suffer, who stands to be harmed, and framing the story from that perspective. One example I'll give is the daily paper in town or the business paper in town might write breathlessly about a new company coming to town, and they're going to have 500 jobs that they're bringing to town, right? And so that's just presented as an unqualified good. The question that my team might ask, again, thinking about who stands to profit, who stands to suffer, is what are the quality of these jobs? Are these jobs going to actually pay enough for people to live on? Are there a lot of government subsidies, which happens a lot in Tennessee and in the States, to prop up these companies, to incentivize them to create these jobs, even though the jobs likely aren't going to pay enough for people to live on? And so we will write those stories. It's a completely different lens, but I always like to say, if you don't ask the right questions, you celebrate the wrong things. So it really starts with asking, like you were saying, Marina, asking the right questions.
Yeah,
I have a quick thing to add to that. So one of the most dangerous questions I have encountered as an investigative reporter has been editors obsessed with the question of is this illegal? And that was a tough one when we were covering tax havens for ICIJ, because we as an industry, and especially as investigative reporters, have bought on the narrative that was set very carefully designed and crafted by the big four accounting firms, which was tax havens are perfectly legal. And that is that was a PR effort that the media completely embraced. You can see that phrase, you search it, and you are going to come up with millions of stories that said, however, offshore investments are perfectly legal. That was a way of covering up. And it's true, by the way, because we have designed laws, just like there were laws that protected slavery. So how many things, horrible things in history have been perfectly legal? And so our job, and we faced a lot of distrust, was to change that question and ask instead, what is the harm? What is outrageous about somebody paying no taxes and having hundreds of millions of dollars hidden in South Dakota, which is a tax haven in the US, or in the British Virgin Islands? It took years. It took years. Right now, I think that in some ways, with all these big disclosures and investigations on this topic, the narrative has changed, and we don't face that question so much anymore. But that was, I think, a good example.
Yeah. So let me push a little bit more on the same topic, which is, in many cases these days, I think we find journalists are increasingly well-educated, increasingly middle class. They are very distant from, not in the case of tax havens, if anything, they're poorer than the people they're writing about. But when you're writing about people who, are in a very different demographic class, live in very different parts of town, and you're not even anywhere close to them, how do you build those well, first, how do you see those stories? But then how do you build those connections and trust so that they don't feel like you're simply taking advantage of their suffering?
Yeah, I think that's tricky, right? I think journalism is extractive in ways that you can't always completely correct for, because you are using somebody's story to make a point. One of the biggest investigation I've done, I'm an editor, but I'm also an investigative reporter, was into the debt collection practices of a nonprofit hospital system in Memphis that was dragging thousands of people into court every year who had made the mistake of being sick and poor at the same time. That was their only mistake. The hospital executives are making millions of dollars, while in court, week after week, literally hundreds of people were being brought in to stand before this judge and the hospital's team of lawyers and face off and share that these people were sharing the most intimate details of their finances in open court in a way that felt very shameful, the way the system operates. And there have been other outlets that have written about medical debt issues. And so I was kind of keyed into this was an issue in Memphis from a completely unrelated story that ProPublica published. And I'd driven past this courthouse a million times in Memphis, but because I'd never been sued, been lucky enough, just luck, for medical debt, I'd never been in this building. But once I went in, and you go downstairs, and you just see the halls lined with black people, almost all black women. And I remember one of the women I ended up writing about a lot who owed over $33,000, and if she'd paid as ordered, she'd be 90 years old by the time she paid off the debt. She looked like my mom. You know, she was like really religious and wore long skirts and no jewelry, no makeup. And so I could really identify with her. But there's some shame, you know, as a journalist that I'd never been down there because that's not been my circumstance. But once you see it, I think it's hard to, once you start looking for it, you see it everywhere, and it's hard to look away.
I think one way to close that or diminish a little bit that the extractive nature of our profession is to pay attention to what do we bring back to the communities that we report on, and how do we make sure that they get to see, to listen, the work that has been done with their cooperation. And a good example of that is a great team at WBEZ, NPR radio in Chicago. They did a great series, investigative series about water debt that affects mostly Black and Latino communities in Chicago, where like there's a whole system that is basically stacked against them. This is not people that just don't want to pay their water bills, needless to say. So the reporters not only integrated, you know, work closely with the community from the beginning, and you know, the community, they needed the water bills, they needed to see documentation that was in the hands of these individuals. But they also committed to bringing back that, they said, we don't listen to NPR, like that's, you know, like that's not who we are, I'm sorry, because you haven't been around here so much. Frankly, we might not identify with the voices that we hear in that radio. So what these reporters did is, first of all, they translated their whole stories, their whole series to Spanish to reach the Hispanic communities. But they also came up with an amazing distribution plan, which was they created postcards in both languages, English and Spanish. They printed 18,000 of those postcards with a QR code, and they mailed them to every single person in the list that they were able to obtain that had a water debt bill, you know, that had water debt in the city. So 18,000 households received this card that when they like flashed their phone over it, it led them directly to the story on the website. And there was also a very nice message on an explanation on the card. So again, something simple, but thoughtful, trying to close that extractive loop and saying, you matter, you help us, here's the stories, and let's continue this conversation however way we can.
In fact, one of the things, I mean, I was a foreign correspondent for many years. You know, one of the things that always thought of when, you know, especially with a lot of parachute journalists coming into town, and that's as true in local communities as it is that, you know, a lot of foreign correspondents don't ever have to see what happens when their story is published. And they know, in fact, that many times the subject of their story will not read their story. And so I've always thought, as a thought experiment, what you really need to do is be able to sit in front of the people that you've described and wait while they read the story. I mean, you can't actually do that, but as a thought experiment, it really kind of changes the way you think about things. I'd like to talk a little bit about language and framing of stories. You know, when we were doing that discussion yesterday, you talked about the man who had to walk 15 miles every day. Can you talk a little bit about that story and about how we think about framing stories?
Yeah, so this was a few years ago in Detroit. The newspaper there wrote a story about a young man who had a job at a car dealership outside of the city of Detroit. And so he walked walked there and back every day. It was like around 15 miles, right? And one day, one of the executives at the car dealership happened to notice this guy walking back and forth, was so impressed with his work ethic and his commitment and dedication that he ended up buying him a car. And so the story was presented as, look at how hard this guy worked, look at the effort he put in getting to work, and isn't it wonderful that he was rewarded for all this persistence with a car? So that's not how I saw that story at all. To me, that was a reflection of how bad mass transit is in the Detroit area. And if you know anything about Detroit, that the lack of mass transit from the city of Detroit which is Detroit is majority black, to the suburbs, which is majority white, was a result of an intentional policy decision, right? The people in the suburbs did not want to make it easy for the people in the city to get there. And so instead of presenting this as, wow, isn't it great this guy got a car, one of the questions, again, starting with the questions I had was, does this worker not make enough on his own to afford a car? So are they paying him enough? Why isn't there mass transit in this community? Does he even want to own a car? Would he prefer to take the bus? Is he going to be able to afford insurance and gas for this car, right? So definitely not the savior kind of narrative in this happy tale, but more we're looking at the systems and institutions in place that created the circumstances where this man had to walk 15 miles one way to work. So it's just, again, who's profiting, who's suffering, who's being harmed? You just come up with different stories.
There was this wonderful quote in a New York Times story, which I quoted to both of you, and it really kind of talks about how language really matters. And so the quote in the story is from a person who says, look, there are two ways you can write this sentence. One way is, black people are often denied loans by banks, which is true. And if you read that sentence, you think, oh, how can we help black people? Are they missing financial literacy? Do they need help filling out forms? What's the issue? What can we do about it? On the other hand, you could also write the absolutely true statement, banks often deny loans to black people. And when you do that, you ask the question, what's wrong with banks? Should there be better regulation? Is there something that they're not doing right? And so I think the idea of how you use language and how you frame stories is also critical, even when we've all agreed on what the story is and what the facts are. I mean, have you got any thoughts, examples, anything like how we can think more intentionally about these things?
I think one area that you and I and others have been discussing a lot is technology coverage. Technologies that, celebration of tech or bashing of tech, the intrigue in Silicon Valley, the latest thing that falls, that crashes, or the latest shining object. And are we really reporting about the impacts of that technology on real people, technology that is being tested, unfinished on real communities and real individuals? So the questions we are asking ourselves as we are trying to think and develop and support more journalists that can report on technologies is precisely how are these Western tech companies creating new forms of colonialism in the global South? Because it's not all happening in Silicon Valley. These technologies are labeled in the Philippines, are tested in South Africa, are deployed in multiple other countries around the world. And we're not reading those stories. I don't know if you are. I'm not reading that. We're studying, yes, we have started to read about some of the things that Facebook does. And speaking of that, that was another lost opportunity, Facebook Files, if you remember. That it was a story that it was a global leak of, that could have put real global framing, global perspective on the impact of this technology worldwide. But a few journalists received it, Western journalists, big corporate media, and they didn't share it with journalists from the global South. And I remember the whistleblower saying, I'm conflating a lot of things here, but it's all more or less related. I remember the whistleblower saying, gee, this is such a global story, that has such repercussions in countries around the world, especially in the Global South. But still, nobody in the Global South was getting those files or invited to be to bring that perspective or be part of the investigation. So talk about framing and talk about deciding who is at the table when these decisions are made, who is invited, who is trusted, and how do we end up, how the story ends up getting out with what perspective.
So how do we sensitize people more, right? I mean, sometimes it's a big sensitivity. Sometimes it is if you're working at whatever news organization have this, that you should think about the other perspectives, and that's sort of an inclusion one. And then the other one is just on a day-to-day basis, how do you make work a little bit better? And I'll pick another example from Reuters. I'll just pick on us for a while, which is, I saw a headline that we had put out that said, voters in Switzerland, go to the polls to of a referendum on same-sex marriage after a heated campaign involving LGBT activists and traditionalists. So I sent the note, and I said, well, let's imagine this was, 1962? When was Loving? Right. 62. Let's imagine this was in the U.S. in 1962, and and the headline was the Supreme Court has just legalized interracial marriage after a heated campaign between civil rights activists and traditionalists. And so, it's a choice of words because tradition, obviously implies something that's good and it's somewhat sacred. And so I sent this, I flagged this, we changed it very quickly, we do lots of good things, and we publish 8,000 stories a day, so you have to let something slide. But then later on, the editor on that story wrote to me and sort of said, look, I think I understood why you asked for the change, but can you explain? And I said everything I've just said. It was a very short email. I said, traditionalists imply something you should think about. And to his credit, he said, yes, I thought so. I got it. I understand. What do we do to try and, just at let's leave aside the question of can you get, some big organization share data with you, but let's just start with the day-to-day. How do we get people more sensitive when they're dealing with this is a pretty bog standard story that just comes through. What do you do to train your people, or what do you do to try and help train people at the organizations you've been at and you've been at?
Yeah, so as we were talking about framing, something came to mind that's really journalism 101. You'll find it in any textbook, and it's to use the active voice over the passive voice. The passive voice tends to obscure the actor. So to your example of, black people are being denied loans, that's passive voice. Black people are being denied loans. But banks deny, that's active voice, and that tells you who is doing the action. So sometimes it's just about getting back to some of the basics of journalism, and active voices is definitely one of them. I think also using precise language and not forcing the reader to have the assumptions you do. For example, like with your example, the word traditionalist, right? You're assuming that everyone is going to think the same thing when you say traditionalist. If you say inner city, what are you really trying to say? Are you trying to say a city where it's mostly people of color? Because not all inner cities might necessarily fit that. I mean, inner city is a geographic thing. It's not necessarily race or class. So just kind of examining your languages and the assumptions that you're making when you use certain words, and just being more precise, which is journalism, right? That's what we all do.
Any thoughts?
And I guess being patient, sometimes we get exasperated, and we are and this educating inside the newsroom falls on people of color. How many times, because I'm from Latin America and have an accent, a very obvious one, I am immediately signaled, so they need a panel, they need somebody to moderate a panel on Central America, so can you do it? I have, I've never lived in, I have never actually go to Central America. I could not possibly, I don't have that knowledge, but it's just all these assumptions and all this. Try to continue educating in a firm but engaging way, I guess, is the only way I see it. Having more conversations about power dynamics in journalism in conferences like these, bring partners, correspondents and local journalists, and have them have a conversation together of how they build that relationship and what they need from each other. Let's include in job descriptions cross-cultural sensitivity. I include it in every single job description, and I don't care if that, maybe those people are not going to need to travel, are not going to need to go to other countries. I still want them to have cross-cultural sensitivity, and we talk about it in the interview. And maybe the question is, tell me about an experience when you reported in a different city, in a neighboring town. What did you do? How did you go about it? What did you learn from that experience?
How intentional are you about hiring people who might have that level of sensitivity that you want?
Yeah, so we're, nonpartisan, but very deliberately progressive. So people who aren't progressive, who don't believe that all workers should make enough to live on, who don't believe that healthcare is a human right, who don't believe in LGBTQ equality, are not going to be a good fit for our newsroom. So I think they some of those people just weed themselves out of the process. But yeah, we're very intentional about that, and we too have in our job descriptions, cultural competency and a willingness to learn. So none of us have arrived. I think this is a journey, and to the point about being patient, I am not a patient person at all. I think I want everything to have been fixed in our society yesterday. But I think recognizing that all of us, including me, have things to learn, and that we learn by being in relationship with other people and being open to being told that we're wrong or we got something wrong, and not being defensive and sitting with that. I have lots of therapy. It's helped me learn to sit with that when someone gives me that critical feedback, whether it's a reader or a coworker, to thank them for bringing that to my attention, and to sit with that, because none of us are perfect.
No, and none of us can represent everything as well. You can't represent all of South America, Latin America. It's not fair. And as I said to people, you can't come to me and ask me, what does the trans community think about this? I don't represent the community, and it's not fair. It's not fair to me, it's not fair to the community, it's not fair to the news organization. I want to open it up for questions. And while you think about questions, I want to ask both of you the magic wand question. So if you had a magic wand and you had, pick whatever news organization you want, ideally not yours, what would you do what is the one or two things you would do to try and make them more sensitive in their coverage overall? Go on.
My magic wand would be that we all have the power to speak multiple languages. Because I feel like linguistic diversity, and there's so many things we could pick, but linguistic diversity, like just by not being able to address people in their languages, we're closing so many doors just to start with. So the first one would be automatic translation, AI translation, and everybody can speak the language that they need.
Including different versions of English.
Exactly.
Because we all speak different dialects to each other, and we don't always recognize that we're speaking different dialects. I have to talk tech to tech, I have to talk business to business, I talk editorial to editorial, and understanding those languages actually builds trust, right? What's your magic wand?
Oh gosh, I don't know, it's too close to 1 o'clock for me to come up with the magic wand. Let me think about it.
Okay, all right. Do we have questions from the floor? Yes.
I just want to ask a question to you all. When they invited you to this panel, did you ask yourself why have they only chosen women to talk about, diverse, more inclusiveness, etc.? It's really awkward, no, that there are no men.
It is awkward, although, I have some experience, so I can bring that to the table where necessary. But yes, no, it's a very fair question. Oh, sorry. The question is, why is the panel all women? Why didn't we have a man on the panel? And it's true. But I will also just say that again, we are here as representatives, but it should not be a panel of representation, right? The idea should be that we should be sensitive enough to reflect views of all groups, even men. But yes, it's a very good question.
I've sat through enough all-male panels in my life that it doesn't remotely bother me to.
You got that one. There was a question over there. Sorry, no, just behind you first, yeah.
Hi, I know we're talking about reporting here, but I also want to ask a more editing-related question. Do you think we'll get to a point where editors can be based out of the global south? I'm right now a senior editor at Direct, and I'm lucky enough to be based in New Delhi and to be editing from the region, but I know that that's not the case for many organizations. Is that something that you think about, or is that something that you think we're headed towards?
So the question, just to repeat for everyone, is, we're talking about reporters, but, we want to talk about editors as well, and will there ever be a time where, and I assume you mean this for large global news organizations, where editors can be based in the global south, but I will expand that to say, if you were running a national organization in the US, could you get to a point where they would not be based in New York or Chicago or LA? You're based in DC.
I think you can definitely do that, and the pandemic gave us all an incredible opportunity. At the beginning of the pandemic, my organization was 100% Washington, DC, a global organization. We are now based in 7 different countries around the world, and only about a third of the staff lives in Washington, DC, and we just changed our hiring practices. We just used that opportunity to say, okay, this is it.
If you were running a national U.S. organization, how different do you think it would be if the editor-in-chief lived in Memphis and the reporters lived in New York and, all of that?
Yeah. Well, you did see when the pandemic started, a lot of journalists leave New York or leave D.C. and to go live elsewhere. They didn't necessarily come to the center of the U.S. Yeah, I don't even know if I had ever dreamed that big, to not have a very coastal focus in the U.S. They call that flyover country for a reason. Everything's either L.A. or it's New York, D.C. I think you'd have a lot more stories from real people, and you'd get to skip all of that presidential year only stories from Iowa, right? Where the first caucuses are. You maybe hear from Iowa more frequently than once every 4 years.
And I would argue it's not so much the global south as it is different places, right? I mean, New Delhi is actually a pretty big cosmopolitan city. And I think the idea, and news organizations tried to fix this by having more diverse staff. So I'm based in New York, but I'm from Singapore, which is also, it's a small country, but it's not a poor country. But I do think that getting multiple perspectives at the table, so not from the reporters, but as you point out, from the editors, and at least having those voices at the table, whatever their title is and whatever their authority is, they need to have voices, and if we can get more of that, I think we have better newsrooms, because we ask better questions, and people say well, that story that you've talked about in New York just doesn't apply to me where I live, right now.
And if your editors are all French and white, then when you are having your weekly decision meeting to decide what's going to go on the cover of the magazine, see who else you can draw from the newsroom.
Yes.
Why do only those editors have to be at the table? So where we can't hire, it doesn't matter. There has to be a reporter, a designer, a photographer, other voices that can be invited as guests, and they can weigh in on the decisions.
There was a question over here. Yes.
Yes. She's very good on the surface of this, but a lot of these panels are unfortunately preaching to the converted. So how would you convert more people, especially when you're not the ones funding, but maybe a small reporter? I know, for example, I'm from Germany, and it's a lot harder to write sentences in a gender-inclusive way, and often you still have to argue very much with editors to edit it out.
So the question is, we all agree in this room, and that's great, but how do we get the people who don't agree with us? And you've had some work on this, so why don't you talk
The
through?
people who don't agree with us, I mean, in the audience?
No, the people who don't agree with us, the editors and to some extent the reporters. How do you change those minds? We're all nodding in here, right? There are people who don't nod.
Try to speak the language that they speak. Try to understand what they know and what their biases are, but also what they care about. So when we were trying to sway editors to work on global collaborations, and we got a lot of no's. Like there were like entire newspapers that would say, like big and small all over the world, that were like, why do we need to do this? Why do we need you? We are, a huge brand. And I guess you keep doing it, and then you show the results, but then you show them how collaboration is good business. If that's what they care about, if what they care about is branding and traffic, and then show them with the work that you are doing that how that can happen for them. So we would try to be like, smart those ways. We also know that in journalism, fear of missing out, FOMO, is a big thing. So we also play with that. So the radio in town is part of this collaboration. Would you also like to be part? I don't know. We tried everything we could.
You have thoughts about how you convince people, and you've struggled with that
Yeah.
for a while too.
So I think, like Marina said, figuring out what's important to them and speaking that language. So if they want to see circulation go up or more subscribers, you can say, I really think we're missing out on this audience when we don't include this angle in the story. You might selectively bring to his attention, did you see this story in competitor's publication where they tackle this? This is really fascinating. I think if you report to this person or they're higher on you than in the org chart, you have to be careful, in a way, because you don't want to get the reputation as being, the raging feminist. Although I love raging feminists, I think that's like a beautiful thing. But it's tricky, and part of the reason I started my own newsroom is because I didn't want to have those conversations with white men anymore, ever again in life. I'm not saying you have to go start your own thing, but it's not, if you have aspirations to be in management, sometimes you just kind of work your angle until you're in the position where you can say, well, actually, no, we're not going to do that. And you also might try to find out who are the allies that are in the room, maybe that are quiet allies. There may be men in there, who would speak up on your behalf, and when you're not in the room for these, gender issues, kind of building a coalition. It's like organizing, basically, in your newsroom.
And make sure that your allies know beforehand, the allies that are going to be around that table, that they know what the issue is and what you're going to pitch, and they can be prepared. So doing a little bit of organizing helps.
Yeah, I hate to give you this answer, but it's both. I'll cut it down simply. This is work, right? And I know that a lot of people in the room, a lot of reporters especially, think that's not my job. Why don't I have smarter bosses? Why isn't my organization better? And the short answer is, I'm sorry, it's your job. It'd be nice if it wasn't, but it is, at least if you want to make it a better place. And so you do have to learn how to community organize. You do have to understand the politics. You do have to understand how to make all this work. And politics is, I know it's a bad word, but it's not a bad word. Politics is about getting things done. And I've spent my entire life code switching, and that's how you get things done. You understand the vocabulary of what people want, and you speak to them in their language. Going to someone and saying, you're an idiot, why don't you do this? Not really a recipe for success, right? And so understanding where they come from, what they want, and and sometimes you'll have a terrible boss, and they won't listen. But the vast majority of people in the world are not trying to be assholes. Well, okay, some. But, and you can work around them if you know what they want, and you can see where there are points of agreement. Time maybe for one or two more questions from anybody else? Yes.
Hi, I happen to believe that the more the reporter is close to a story and the more involved
So the question is really about how do you balance passion, which can really drive and animate great coverage, with, I guess, a sense of, well, accuracy, soberness, making sure that the passion doesn't overwhelm the story and make it more than it is.
I am going to steal this from Surya Matu, who is a reporter at the Markup. It's a nonprofit focused on AI accountability. And he was telling me today that he says, my stories are never the spicy ones that get everybody on Twitter on fire, but are the most resilient ones. So when I publish, people tend to be like, oh, well, we kind of knew that about Google or Facebook. But they are the ones that persist in time, that are resilient, and that end up informing policy. He said it in a very humble way, but it's true. So he always says, I try to, he said, I'm of Indian background, he said, and for me it's really hard to say this, but for me, I always spice down, and it's medium spice. And that's how he deals with his passion for the issue. He's kind of like biased, toward like big tech, but he's even bigger bias for accuracy and responsible reporting.
How do you manage reporters who are too enthusiastic, maybe?
Yeah, I think it's the fairness and the accuracy and challenging everything. That old journalism saw, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. Like, what's your proof? And so I think if you're really passionate about a topic, you may be more likely, and this happened with one of our reporters recently, more likely to accept what an advocate says as fact without asking how do they know what they know. And I'm sure my reporter was sick of me by the time I was done editing the story, but I hope it allowed him to sleep well at night, knowing that we'd vetted everything in this story. And the story still was about homelessness. It still had a pro-housing stance, housing first stance. So I don't think we erased the passion or our commitment to covering the issue, but it makes our content more reliable if careful readers aren't noticing things that they're like, well, how do they know that? How would they know that? How did they back that up? And we offer no support. So, again, I think it's journalism basically just being really mindful of that.
And part of it is also just saying, look, don't just get a quote on the other side. Make the best case you can for the other side. And then if it's a bad case, pick it apart. But make the best case. Show that you've heard and listened to the other side. So we are pretty much at time. I will just first apologize for Lydia, whose computer battery died just before this went on. So real shame that we could not hear from her. Thank you all for coming. I will reiterate a couple of really good lessons. One, learn a lot of languages, which is great. Humility and intentionality, but really basics. A lot of all we're talking about here is basics, and what we've done, I think, is oftentimes just let other things get in the way of basics. Sometimes a nice turn of phrase, a good story that we can't put down, and sometimes you just have to go back and interrogate yourself, and if you do, and ask yourself all those questions, that's where the real story is, and that's where we do so much better for all the communities that we say we want to serve. So I know you all agree. But thank you. Go spread the word, play the politics, get it done, make every place you work better. Thank you, and go get a drink.